Hello, my name is Jacob, and this is my BNA video project about the Royal Proclamation of the year 1763. Issued by King George III on October 7, 1763, the Royal Proclamation is a document that set out guidelines for the European settlement of Aboriginal territories in North America. Its main purpose was to assimilate the French population in Nouvelle France, and because of this, the policy was in favor of the British, as Quebec was under Britain's control after the Treaty of Paris, which was signed in 1763. So, why did the Royal Proclamation thing happen in the first place? Well, to answer that question, we have to know the two events that caused the proclamation, one of them being the Battle of the Plains of the Abraham. This battle was the final attack of Britain in 1759, which happened during the Seven-Year War, and Britain won. After the battle, territories such as Montreal started to surrender to the British, resulting in Britain's gain of control over the French. Britain's victory and transfer of power led to the Treaty of Paris, which stated that Britain had control of almost the entire Nouvelle France. So basically, Britain's gain of control motivated themselves to assimilate the French population, which led them to the Royal Proclamation of 1763. Then comes the Pontiac's resistance. Pontiac was an Ottawa First Nation war chief who had fought with the French against Britain before the French had surrendered. So after Britain took control, Pontiac tried to ally with the British, but he failed. And because of how Britain didn't want to ally with them, Pontiac's people had to suffer under Britain. So Pontiac united with other First Nations and fought the British. Ultimately, in 1763, Pontiac's force managed to overtake 9 out of the 12 British forts in the regions of the 13 colonies. And Britain recognized the danger and immediately started to negotiate peace with them, which ensured the First Nations rights to their lands. As this motivated Britain to maintain a good relationship with the First Nations, Pontiac's resistance played a crucial role in creating the Royal Proclamation. Now that we know what caused the proclamation, let's look at the specific assimilation policies of the documents. Through the Royal Proclamation, one of the major changes was the borders of Quebec. Britain decided to shrink Quebec's territory to only include the settled areas along the St. Lawrence River, making the outstanding territory the Indian Territory. Also, the residents had to apply for a permit from the governor to travel west of these boundaries, restricting their freedom. Because Britain now had control over Quebec, they obviously wanted to force their religion onto the French population. Their ultimate goal was to gradually assimilate the Roman Catholic population into a Protestant population. This leads to the legal structure of Quebec under the control of Britain, which I will explain right after, but basically, the French were excluded from the government system itself if they did not convert to Protestantism. Even though it used to be their land, they were no longer considered a citizen if they did not abandon Roman Catholicism. And this shows how much loyalty Britain demanded from the French, which in my opinion, Britain's asking way too much from the French. As it shows later on, the demand only caused resentment from the French population. Under Britain's control, French laws were abolished and they were forced to accept Britain's laws. Also, Britain had originally promised to form an elected assembly to help govern Quebec, just like how other British colonies operated. However, as mentioned before, Britain really hated Roman Catholicism, which is why they decided to give the voting rights to the Protestants only, when it's supposed to be an elected assembly. Therefore, if the French wanted to take part in the government, they had to take an oath, and the oath was called Serment du Test, which was basically stating that they were now a member of the Anglican Church. Because of such oppressiveness, almost all governments were English. Now, you might say that these policies were way too harsh, which I totally agree with you. In reality, the French were no longer enemies of Britain, which is why it was no good for the British to make them unhappy, which can potentially cause the revolt of the French population. This is why the first governor, James Murray, was dismissed due to the large complaints from the French population. And the next governor, Sir Guy Carleton, he recognized the French people's complaints and decided to revoke the Royal Proclamation and bring in the Quebec Act, which was in favor of the French. Apart from the assimilation of the French, there is another purpose of the Royal Proclamation. If we go back to Pontiac's resistance, the First Nations wanted better treatments from the British, right? Well, that is exactly what the Royal Proclamation did for them. Royal Proclamation created a clear boundary between the British colonies and lands reserved for First Nations. The colonists were forbidden to trespass on the land west of the Proclamation line, and the ownership of the lands only went to the British Crown. This meant that individuals and companies could no longer claim Aboriginal land without a legal treaty between the British government and the First Nations of the involving land. This ultimately supported the First Nations to establish their rights to their lands. So in a brief summary, the Royal Proclamation was in favor of the First Nations / the British and was extremely against the French. So now let's connect the topic with two historical thinking concepts. Number 1, cause and consequence, and number 2, ethical dimensions. So basically, cause and consequence were explained earlier in the video when I was explaining about what had caused the Royal Proclamation. However, if we do look at what the Royal Proclamation caused, we can see how the policy was extremely biased in favor of the British and against the French population. Also, the First Nations definitely enjoyed their benefits as well. This eventually caused the revolt of the French population, leading to the Quebec Act. And moving on to the ethical dimensions, by how Britain treated the French through the Royal Proclamation, it is reasonable for anyone to wonder if those treatments were justifiable, especially since all the treatments were very cruel. To answer that question, we have to look at the treatment in the view of modern perspective and the perspective of the past. Number 1, modern perspective. If we look at it from our modernized point of view, the treatments that the French received are definitely inhumane. Though restricting their boundaries could be justified as Britain had won the war, the way how they constrained the French people's religion is very unacceptable. This is really obvious since in a democratic society right now, it is the citizens' right to have freedom over their religion, making Britain's actions back in time cruel and unethical. And of course, we cannot forget about the past perspective. Though it's unethical from the modernized point of view, when we start to consider and understand the social norms in the past, Britain's treatments could be justified. Back in 1763, they did not care about how the French people would not be able to practice their religions, since they didn't have such thing as freedom of religion. Freedom of religion did not exist back then, and even if you were not the losers of a war, you had to follow the country's choice of religion. This basically means that if a king wanted to practice another religion, everyone in the country was obligated to follow the king's decision and change their religion as well. And even apart from the religious aspect, it's also reasonable for Britain to change how things operated from the French methods to the British methods because they were the winners. And back then, it was normal for the winners of a war to do that. So that's the end of my video, and for those of you who didn't really know about the topic, hopefully you now know a little bit more about the Royal Proclamation of 1763 after watching this video. Thank you.